The Rick and Morty anime was a surreal experience, to say the least, and one that is very controversial and divisive with its viewers. For today's video, I'm going to break down the overarching plot of the 10-episode series, explaining some of the more confusing parts for those who did see it, and going over the story as a whole for those who don't want to see it, but want to understand what this was all about. The Rick and Morty anime is not a production of the team behind Rick and Morty, and instead was something put together by Adult Swim without any involvement of the original writers or even the cast. Adult Swim is well known for showing both Western comedy animation and imported Japanese anime, with a few attempts to bridge the gap between the two with original productions, and the Rick and Morty anime is just the next link in that chain. The story follows Rick and Morty as they deal with the sudden time travel shenanigans brought upon by Morty's new girlfriend, the alien named Elle. Elle is from a race of beings who can see the future, meaning they know exactly how their lives are going to start and finish. But for Elle in particular, that has led to her being stuck in a time loop, trying to get the perfect life with Morty. This eventually gets the Smith family wrapped up in a large battle against the Galactic Federation, who wishes to have Elle's power of destruction trapped within a bomb for themselves. The themes of this series were surprisingly complex, but they can be hard to get a handle on without extensive rewatches because the actual linear progression of the story is also surprisingly complex, and in this case that isn't exactly great. The first episode is called The Girl Who Manipulates Time, and it focuses primarily on Morty playing a virtual reality game created by Rick, which is later revealed to be made with portal gun fluid that makes it a more realistic and immersive experience where Morty can travel to other timelines. This seems like a fun adventure game in space, but Morty notices something is wrong when he's running away from a giant worm and notices another Morty in a similar but different colored suit being chased by another worm. Following this, Morty meets Elle, who introduces herself as a warrior who controls time after saving Morty from the monster. Elle gives her name and backstory as if Morty doesn't know her, but she specifically says it's good to see him again, hinting already that Elle has a long history with this or another Morty that our Morty is unaware of. Within the game, there are multiple Mortys, however, and each is having a different outcome. One such Morty meets Mullet Rick, who explains that all these different realities are experiencing the sudden existence of Elle in various forms. Mullet Rick comes from a dimension where Morty is dead, and he thought he'd never see a Morty again, but due to whatever happened with Elle, he is suddenly stranded in the past. Another version of Elle that appears in this game appears to be Frank, a male character who, in his timelines, shows nothing but support for Morty to make him a successful man that helps him shape the world positively, but there will be more to say about him at the end of the video. What's important here is that in this game, Morty got to experience several timelines on a fast forward, before Summer suddenly turned his game off, leaving Morty feeling crushed that he lost what felt like the greatest love he would ever experience with Elle. This was considered a confusing first episode with all of its different timelines, and as the series progressed, it really only got more confusing. But what this episode was meant to do was give us a big overview of what Elle and Morty's relationship is. While the rest of the series will progress rather slow, the first episode showed us multiple versions of what would happen to Morty if Elle or Frank was suddenly in his life, which in every dimension has them being a supportive love where Morty mostly gets what he wants in terms of happiness. But this doesn't always lead to a long life, as we will learn. After getting kicked out of his video game, Morty finds the planet he believes that he met Elle on and is directed there to Mullet Rick, who gives Morty the story of his Morty, who is also known as Space Morty within the anime. Across multiple episodes, we learn that Elle was from a race of beings who can see the future, and who were thought to be wiped out by the Galactic Federation because the threat they could pose to their plans for galactic domination. This race of beings seemingly saw their fate at the time of their birth, however, and accepted their place in the ever-changing galactic system. One, however, survived this, named Elle. Elle ended up meeting Space Morty, and just like in all of the timelines that would follow, she fell in love with him and supported him through his personal dreams. At the time and in the dimension that Elle first met Space Morty, this meant just becoming a hero out in space helping to fight the Galactic Federation. Elle didn't just help Morty with this, but had arranged it so he'd take all the glory and become a hero in the galaxy to all of the freedom fighters, but he always credited his love for Elle as the reason for his great success. On one of these missions to fight the Federation, however, Space Morty ends up dying. Mullet Rick and Elle discuss this after the fact, with Mullet Rick questioning why Elle didn't change Morty's fate if she loved him so much. Elle explains that she can't interfere with free will. All she can really do is support someone with what their free will tells them they want to do. This leads to Morty getting what he wants out of his life, but Elle can't stop that from leading to a particular demise. Elle is said to experience all of time at every moment, meaning she still, in a way, is with Space Morty even after he has died, but she makes the choice to stop living into the linear future that other people experience and instead convinces Mullet Rick to send her back in time. This is done by converting Elle herself into antimatter, which could reverse time with an explosion, but if guided by a sentient being like Elle, could also just reverse time without destroying the universe. This is not something Mullet Rick is sure will work, and instead, even if he does succeed, he believes the universe created would essentially be exactly the same, meaning Elle would be caught in the same story with the same tragic outcome for Space Morty. Elle seems okay with this, though she mentions that just enough of the timelines change due to the chaos that they are creating with this experiment, and that this could lead to a slightly different world. This makes Mullet Rick realize that he has lived this life many times before, that he is trapped in a loop with Elle, resetting the universe every time that his Morty dies. This Rick is a lot more sentimental than the other Ricks are portrayed, and the Ricks as a whole are presented as a lot more sentimental and well-meaning here in the anime than in the original series. Here, Mullet Rick realizes that he's been recreating this loop in many ways for himself, having a strong desire to go back in time and see his Morty again, and experience all the adventures and watching him grow up. However, Elle mentioned making possible changes to the timeline, and while she doesn't stop Space Morty's death, she does end up making a change to Mullet Rick's actions. In his usual loop, Mullet Rick would turn Elle into antimatter and then use a machine to project her into the past, but he has become tired of the cyclical existence that he has begun to remember through vivid deja vu. And he tells Elle to send a message to the next version of himself where he says there is meaning in the meaningless. This is because Mullet Rick himself is recognizing that he is finding meaning in Morty's life, wanting to go back to it more than anything else that there is in the universe. Mullet Rick claims to already remember the message that he sent through Elle, but this shows that Elle is able to make changes to the timeline as she didn't tell Mullet Rick this before. She just isn't able to interfere with free will itself. By doing something that Mullet Rick specifically asked her to do, she set in place a new sequence of events where Mullet Rick wants to escape the loop that he is trapped in, and instead of sending Elle to the past, he sends the antimatter container bomb with her essence to Rick C-137. C-137, or Our Rick as I tend to call him, would end up trapped in a space-time distortion with this bomb, where the essence of Elle is able to escape her antimatter form and create a new body, one that looks more human and more to Morty's taste. Elle's hope here, at least as far as Mullet Rick can deduce, is to use Morty to blow up the antimatter device in her original dimension, ending the loop that she was trapped in there and allowing her to exist with Morty in this and other dimensions. Morty, however, is unable to bring himself to do this, as it would be killing an entire universe worth of people to just have his girlfriend. When the Galactic Federation comes after the antimatter bomb that contains her essence, Elle ends up sacrificing herself so both she and the bomb are removed from existence. Morty is devastated by this, and in the final episode, we see him chasing fantasy alternate timelines with Elle in the virtual reality game from episode 1. And, like in that episode, it ends with Morty being pulled out of the world unceremoniously, this time by Rick, with the helmet being damaged and it not being safe for Morty to use it again in the future to experience more of these timelines. Without that problem, Morty would have become just like Elle, chasing a love he felt in the past by living it on a constant loop, trying to change the story to be a little bit better each time. This, of course, is a rather simple explanation of the plot, which was told a lot more intricately, with constant cuts between our Rick and Morty and the current timeline, with Space Morty and these other timelines such as we see in the games. Throughout the series, a lot of viewers reported having a hard time understanding which Rick and Morty were on the screen at any given time, with constant cuts between the different dimensions and timelines, and not a lot of explanations about it. But once each timeline is laid out more linearly like we've done here, it becomes easier to understand the mythological and esoteric inspirations for the show. Elle, of course, is a brand new character created for this anime, who is described as being from a race of aliens who could see their entire lives from the moments they were born. This is interesting because her name Elle appears to be a reference to the term El from Jewish and earlier Canaanite tradition. El is the name of the father god in the Canaanite tradition that Judaism grew out of, with the term Elohim being one of the two most frequent words used to refer to God in the Old Testament. Elohim is a pluralization of El, and in the Jewish tradition is said to give a plural majesty to God, making him infinite and not limited, with the other word, or rather name, used to refer to God being Yahweh. According to Jewish tradition, it is meditating on the name of God Yahweh that's used to receive the gift of prophecy. This is implied in various myths to be a gift taught by the B'nai Elohim, or the sons of Elohim in Jewish mythological texts, such as in the Book of Enoch, where they are also referred to as the Watchers. Like the race of aliens that El belongs to in the Rick and Morty anime, these entities were able to see the consequences of their choices to rebel against God by taking human wives, but chose to do so anyways because they were willing to enjoy what their rebellious actions gave them in return for the punishments they would later receive. The Watchers are described in the Book of Enoch as doing this because of their lust for human women, and already you can see the connection to El in particular, who has built her entire existence around being in love with one particular human, Morty. El's entire race seemed to face an extinction that she was meant to be a part of as well, but one she was able to escape because everyone else was able to die, given the impression that the entire race had been wiped out. With this being something of a choice that she made that the others were unwilling to, because she foresaw herself loving Morty and wanted to see that through. In order to thematically explain the story of El, the show also makes a point of having Jerry bring up the Greek legend of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is a Greek mythological king who deceived the gods in order to escape death. For this, he was punished by Zeus to be forever trapped in Hades until he can push a boulder to the top of a hill. However, every time Sisyphus tries to push the boulder up, it just rolls back down, and Sisyphus finds himself in a never-ending punishment that is impossible to escape. Despite this, the understanding of the Sisyphus myth is that there is meaning in trying to escape even when you know it's not going to work, in waking up and pushing that boulder every day instead of just sitting there and doing nothing because you know it is pointless. It's the idea of appreciating that the boulder may not roll as far back down as it did the day before, and even if it will the day after that, it still feels like progress and you can attach meaning to that. This is what El is essentially going through with her time loop, trying to save Morty but only being able to change things ever so slightly. Where this gets crazy in the show is how El actually manages to change time to some degree, sending messages from the earlier loop Mullet Rick to the future one. While El is presented as someone who is simply happy to live in the loop and appreciate the time she has with Space Morty in it, Mullet Rick theorizes that she has actually seen the final outcome of her choices and has been repeating the loop perhaps millions of times, knowing that eventually the little changes would add up to something even greater than just getting to repeat her love story with Morty. She had set Mullet Rick up from the beginning, knowing the way he operates would lead to him repeating the loop until he eventually couldn't handle it anymore. She could only ever give him little nudges, but it was ultimately a message from himself that made him go through with the idea of giving the antimatter bomb to another Rick. However, one thing El didn't seem to predict was how unpredictable our Morty might actually be. Mullet Rick insists that El has seen how everything will transpire, but she still seems surprised by Morty not being able to go through with destroying her original universe. Morty insists that he's not Space Morty, the Morty that El really fell in love with, and that he can't go through with killing everyone in her universe in order to be with her. This only intensifies when Morty gets a tour of the world that he had become a hero in, where Space Morty had become a symbol for freedom in a galaxy that was being forced into submission by the Galactic Federation. He saw what El's love could do for him and do for the entire galaxy, but in return for that love, she now wanted Morty to destroy that entire universe just so they could continue to be together. El is a force that can change entire galaxies for the better with her interference, but what she is chasing more than anything is the love for one particular person. Since that one person, Morty, is good, that makes the work she does through him good as well. Our Morty has those elements in him, but at the time that he met El, he was in a different place than Space Morty was. His fixation became on her the way her fixation was on him, and instead of joining the Galactic Federation, our Morty just played Monopoly with El in the living room and spent time talking with her under the tree in their yard. This is what our El wanted all along, telling Space Morty that what she wanted more than anything before he died was just to spend some time with him on Earth in his own element. But even with his happy life, Morty is just unwilling to destroy an entire other world. El herself is shocked by this, saying she never meant to traumatize Morty, even though this timeline is what she seemed to be aiming for. It gives the indication that El had been operating by the technical rules of allowing free will, but rather selfishly, missing the spirit of the law in order to manipulate time in a way that the other members of her species were unable to. But she was not able to predict just how much it would hurt herself to see that she had hurt Morty instead of helping him. L's ultimate plan was asking Morty to erase everything good that Space Morty had done because of L, and she begins to realize that her desire to be in Morty's life is actually making it worse instead of better. She had become fixated on being happy with him, so much so that she forgot there are certain things he needs in order to be happy outside of her. So in the end, L did seem to actually change the course of history, creating yet another dimension where our Morty is able to reach his fullest potential through her own sacrifice. Now, in addition to being unnecessarily complex and hard to follow, there is a lot of reason why people might not like this Rick and Morty anime. These more overt religious themes can be a bit out of style for Rick and Morty. While they aren't above playing with mythological conspiracies on a smaller scale in the original show, they don't generally give it this sort of seriousness or reverence. The original show talks a lot about the meaninglessness of life, but this miniseries is the story of a godlike entity teaching us just how meaningful everything is. Don't get me wrong, the original series did still have its characters appreciating what they have and finding a sense of meaning in the meaninglessness, but it's with the understanding that nothing actually matters. Here, we go the opposite direction and get very emotional takes on how much that nothingness actually matters because of what we feel in the moment. The characters in the anime are also rather different, with them all having sort of different default personalities than we get in the actual show. In the case of the characters Rick and Morty, it comes from the anime being less about motion and more about limited frame use. This makes it better to have slower talking and more conversational characters. Rick in particular becomes rather sentimental and borderline heroic, and Morty unfortunately just becomes something of a slave reaction to L. At the end of the day, she's the only real character in the story, with everyone else really just being a default skin of the universe made to interact with her. The Ricks themselves even emphasize that they're all being dragged along by L and her desires, meaning they really don't have a sense of free will in the way that she's defining it. Even outside of those characters and the style changes, there are also some differences with the characters that just don't seem to ring true. For instance, Beth and Space Beth seem to have a dynamic that is different from in the show, with them acting like they are competing for the family and Rick's love in a way that never really happened in the original series, even if they did butt heads and have their own emotional issues. Beth even treats herself like she is pathetic at one point, asking Jerry if he regrets marrying her. These are all things that could happen in the original show, but the way they play out in the anime does feel rather fanficky and alternate universe-y, despite this Rick and Morty still having the designation of C-137 like in the original series. Ultimately, this is just its own story that doesn't need to connect to the original, and it's not a bad presentation of what another version of Rick and Morty could be, but it is nothing like the original series. To me, this is good, not because the original is bad, but because I'd rather see an anime version of Rick and Morty in particular do essentially what it did, instead of just try and be Rick and Morty with an anime skin. I understand why people wish the style was a bit different, I understand why people wish the story wasn't so hard to follow, and I understand a lot of the other wishes that people had for this series, but at the end of the day, it's the kind of entertainment that I like, regardless of the weird rebooty cash cow nature of it. It's an anime-styled story with pretty interesting esoteric themes that has some great rewatch value. The show itself is about the loop that the characters are trapped in, with there being constant cuts to alternate timelines and flashbacks that make returning to certain moments just feel cozy and beautiful. It's reminiscent of Fooly and Serial Experiments Lane, and while it may not have the original production crew of Rick and Morty involved with it, that doesn't make it any less valid than any other artist injecting their own original stories into an intellectual property that a studio is trying to make more money off of. At the end of the day, what makes something art is what the artist is able to put into it, even if they are being forced to use characters and symbols of a corporation to make them more money. What we got here was an anime made by a team who were able to just take the premise of Rick and Morty and create a new story reminiscent of the niche and alternative anime genre. And a lot of people just aren't gonna like that for any reason at all, even if I do. But if there's one thing I think people might hate more than anything, it's just Frank. Frank was a hard to understand character when he first appeared in episode 1 of the Rick and Morty anime, and he didn't appear again until the finale, where Morty retreats inside of the VR headset to spend more time with L, only to have his life interfered with by Frank. Here, Frank is seen as a negative influence who keeps Morty away from what he really wants. And like L, Frank realizes the negative impact he can have on Morty's life. But who exactly is Frank? We learned that the story that Mullet Rick was giving us was not from the first time that he had done this loop with L, but rather by the time he started to experience deja vu, he had perhaps already lived countless millions of lives trapped in this loop with L. Every time she would live this loop, she would change things ever so slightly, and I believe changing herself into a female was the first thing she actually eventually did. Just as she would eventually make herself human when she had the chance by jumping to Rick C-137's dimension, I believe that the video game character Frank is just an earlier iteration of Elle when she was male before she decided to turn female. In the video game from episode 1, Frank saw Morty and wanted to help him, but was too afraid to do it at that time. He later came back stronger with a special mech suit that allowed him to help Morty. This hints at Elle's story of trying to come back to save Morty from his own fate. However, Frank's relationship with Morty can only ever go so far. In the video game timeline where Morty meets Frank, he has a deep friendship with Frank, but the two can only ever be so close, and Morty still feels love for women. He never settles down, but he does see many women in his time changing the world with Frank's help. Morty even mentions to Frank at some point that he thinks Frank looks silly in his mech suit, with Frank saying he likes it because it makes him feel like more of a real man. This seems to point to Elle first being a man in Space Morty's timeline before Mullet Rick was convinced to turn him into antimatter, where he could return to the beginning of the universe and be reborn in a form that Morty would find more interesting, that of a woman, Elle. Even back when only episode 1 had aired, viewers noticed the F on Frank's suit and believed it would connect to Elle's name, which when abbreviated would have spelled elf. Elves, of course, in European mythology, were fantasy beings of power that were said to have control over the fates of humans when they chose to interact with them, and were said to be capable of bringing both blessings and curses. At first, Morty rejects the help of Frank to live his best life in order to live with a human version of Elle who he'd simply met in high school. Morty, however, rejects the opportunity from Frank to have a great life with a good paying job in order to take care of his family, with Frank seemingly being the essence of Elle from the earlier versions of this game that is still retained. Morty's rejection of Frank's help leads to a miserable timeline where Morty can't even support his wife and daughter and gets jealous of Frank for trying to help him do that. But in the end, Morty comes to understand the tricky balance of the differences between getting what you think you want and finding your ultimate happiness. The game was promised by Rick to give him his ultimate happiest life, and that ended up just being a reflection of the life he already had. One where he had the opportunity to live a dreamlike existence with Elle, only to reject it out of fear of its consequences consuming him. Only for him to then end up in the virtual reality game where he has the fantasy version of the happy ending that he had to give up. Even with this explanation of Frank, his story is still very hard to understand, and I'm not even sure I really got it all here. And I'm certain there's at least more to this story that I haven't figured out. For me, the Rick and Morty anime was still an enjoyable experience, however, even more entertaining than some of the seasons of the actual Rick and Morty show, but it doesn't have to be a contest. Rick and Morty popularized the idea of the infinite universe with different versions of yourselves that ended up being used by existing studios to explore alternate timelines in their existing intellectual properties. With this trend finally coming back full circle to Rick and Morty, with Adult Swim making this anime without the help of the original team. It was a show rooted in originality that less clever studios would copy, only for that to end up becoming the fate of Rick and Morty itself here, but at the end of the day, it works for me. Rick and Morty the anime had some pretty comfy vibes, and it's the kind of anime project I wish we saw more of in the recent years. Though I'm not checking out every anime that pops up, there's something about the Rick and Morty anime's old school style that just works for me. It almost feels like something you would see on Adult Swim, more so back in the 2000s. That doesn't mean everyone has to like it, but if you made it this far, you at least found something about it interesting or worth getting an explanation for. And I hope this video helped you think of it as a fun thing that got to exist, even if you didn't like it for yourself. But let me know how much you do hate it in the comments down below, as I know most of you do, and that's just okay. See you guys next time.